Now let's bring our guest has worked on policy in D.C. for many years. He's a fellow at the American Economic Liberties Project. He's the author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. He's one of the most prominent thinkers on markets and monopolies. In other words, he's an egghead. Please welcome back to the show, Matt Stoller. Matt, how are you?
Hey, great to be here.
So,
that was an awesome intro.
Matt, thank you for being here, and thank you for having to endure me yelling at you over a webcam one time. That was tough, I know.
That was really hard. It was the hardest thing ever. Oh, my God. The policy choices that we've made to allow for this concentration of power are the same policy choices that have hardened our society, that have created an epidemic of elite lawlessness. And they're philosophical choices about whether we want a democracy or not. And when you concentrate power the way that we have, and I look at antitrust, I look at regulation, I look at these kind of media policy, and when you concentrate power the way that we have over the last 30 or 40 years, it means that you are not trying to build a society, a democracy. You're trying to build an oligarchy. And this is what happens. And so I'm worried that we're not going to get to that root cause. But I also think we can. I don't think this stuff is rocket science. I think there are solutions here. And we're not that far away from them, although both sides are pretty hardened and don't want to actually get there.
So, Matt, you talk about, you touched on something that most people don't know anything about, and it's super important to our democracy, which is antitrust laws.
Right.
Right. And the fact that Barack Obama didn't enforce any of them, and the fact that we haven't enforced them. So I can't remember when the last time. I think they did something with Microsoft.
Yeah.
Was the last thing they did. Remember when I was a kid, they broke up AT&T. I remember when that happened, right?
Right.
So, and then it just took a little while for AT&T to come all back together. Anyway, but so talk about that. So is that what you mean, by the way, when you say these are policy decisions that have created this? So by letting the Silicon Valley have all this power, that's a policy decision by government. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. So for those of you who don't know, antitrust law is the body of law where lawyers bill $1,000 an hour to tell the government to let powerful people do anything they want. Oh, wait, sorry, that's every body of law right now. Antitrust law is the body of law that is supposed to deal with concentrations of market power. There are a bunch of other areas of law that deal with that too. There's different forms of public utility law. There's, there's the legal framework is kind of scattered around the government. There's consumer protection law, there's privacy law. All of these deal with what we call market structure. But yeah, the current kind of environment of social media was created over the last 20 years or so. I mean, these are relatively new companies. Facebook, I think, was founded in 2004 or 5. Google was founded in the late 90s. YouTube is the big sort of social element there. Twitter, and these are mid 2000s companies. Their business model is basically they compile detailed dossiers on people, and then they follow them around the web and show them ads. And in doing that, they redirect a lot of money that used to go to local newspapers and publishers and artists to themselves. And for a lot of reasons, it's anti-competitive. They effectively use the Wall Street Journal's own data to target the Wall Street Journal's readers in places where the Wall Street Journal doesn't make any money. So they're basically using the content of what news gatherers create, but they monetize it and keep the money. And that's why every newspaper is really going bankrupt. A fourth of American newspapers have disappeared in the last 10, 15 years. And a lot of the rest of them, and these particularly local ones, have been totally hollowed out. So this is a very dangerous anti-competitive business model, but it happened because the antitrust enforcers and regulators at the Federal Trade Commission didn't actually enact rules when these business models were being created. So they didn't create, say, a do not track list. A do not track list would have allowed users to say, no, I don't want to be surveilled. And these things tend to be popular. When they implemented a do not call list, say, don't call me, don't call me at dinner, millions of people signed up for it. And they would have done that with do not track. And this was completely within the FTC's authority. Had they done that, social media model would have gone in a different direction. The same thing is true with mergers. So back in the mid 2000s, when Facebook was first emerging, they were competing with MySpace. And MySpace And the way they competed with MySpace was interesting because they said, oh, MySpace, you don't want to use that. That's like, unsafe. Everything's public. It's kind of gross. There's all these weirdos on there. Facebook is safe. You can just meet the people you know at college, and we even let you vote on our terms of service, and we'll protect your data. This is how they competed. And then when they killed all their competitors, in 2014, they said, okay, we're going to surveil the hell out of you. And they bought their they didn't just kill MySpace. They also, which they beat in the marketplace, so that's fine. They also bought Instagram and they bought WhatsApp, who were two major competitors, and they bought them because they were competitors. Now, if you think about it, what they were doing is they were competing by differentiating their products on privacy grounds, saying this is going to be safer, it's nicer, it will keep your stuff private. And then when they killed all their competition, they were like, fuck that, whatever. And the thing is that if you had competition today, real competition in social media and in these business models, and you didn't allow for this invasive surveillance targeted ad model, then you would see a race to the top of a bunch of different communication networks who would say, I'll keep your data safer. I'll let you communicate more efficiently. I won't try to addict you, which, again, that's another thing that they do with their user interfaces. I won't harm your mental health, which, again, is another thing that they do. But they don't do that because there isn't a lot of competition, and the whole model is based on surveilling you and then manipulating you to do things. So that's a whole model that shouldn't exist, and it only exists because of policy choices that the Bush administration and then the Obama administration and then the Trump administration made. And I guess the last thing I'll say, just in terms of the policy leverage point, is in 2011, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, came out with an order over Facebook saying, you've been lying to people about your data practices. And Facebook said, oh, we won't do it again. And they put them under order. Now, an order has a very powerful legal tool. If you violate it, it's about $40,000 fine per violation. Google also has one of these consent decrees. There are all these companies that have consent decrees. Well, in 2018, when The Guardian revealed that Facebook had been sharing data with Cambridge Analytica and that they've been violating the order, and not just once, but tens of millions of times. Well, you take tens of millions or hundreds of millions of times and you multiply that by $40,000, that is a company-killing fine. So the FTC could have gone to Facebook and said, you've been collecting this data to do your invasive, addictive business model. You violated the order. Either change your business model or you're out of business, or we own you. And they didn't do that. Instead, they gave them what effectively was a parking ticket. So there have been all of these missed opportunities to make sure that these business models are not monopolistic, are not harmful, do not radicalize people, but we didn't take advantage of any of them. And I think, and this is kind of what I argue, is like we should be going and saying, let us drain the poison out of these radicalization engines. Let's turn them into like neutral communication tools. Like nobody ever says Verizon really needs to clean up what's happening on its network, because they don't make money by getting you to do crazy shit. They just sell you overpriced phone service. And that's a problem that we can it's a problem because it's too expensive, but they're not destroying democracy, right?
Right.
Anyway.
So what I don't think people even realize how monopolistic it became. As you laid it out, what happened with Facebook, how they drove their competition out of business. And then when there was no competition left, except for WhatsApp, they went and they paid $20, not million, billion for an app. Right. That's how they can stifle competition. And so now WhatsApp, which was the basis of it was exactly what you laid out. They weren't going to track you. They weren't going to share your data, none of that stuff. Facebook just said, if you want to use that, you have to either delete this app or we're going to share all that information that you've put on this app. So you have to delete it before February 8th. So that's the kind of, who's got $20 billion and who can resist $20 billion, right? So if I started another social media company that was actually neutral the way you said it, and then Facebook comes along or Twitter and offers me $20 billion, I don't think anybody could say no to that. So that's where the government is supposed to come in and break up those monopolies or institute regulations like the kind that you were just talking about. Like we won't track you, which would have made, and we won't addict you. We won't use algorithms that make you addicted. So those are the things that government should do and should have been doing, but they didn't. And it's because of You tell me if it's this true, but it's because of the corporate capture of our government, and it didn't start yesterday, right? Is that the reason why we haven't been instituting antitrust laws?
I think that that's too easy an explanation. I am both more I don't know, pessimistic and optimistic. I think it's really a matter of ideas. I just don't think that, my book, I go over the history of what happened in the 1970s. Kind of the left got this very consumer oriented mindset, right? So the Democrats and the left used to be kind of like small business and labor. What they called small capital and labor would be fighting against monopolies and finance, right? That was the traditional political architecture in the U.S. going back hundreds of years. Go back to England, and you could find that architecture too, the 1600s. Well, so in the 1970s, this changed for a variety of reasons, and the left started thinking our enemy is not just big business; our enemy is all business. So not how do we do business, but business is bad. This is a kind of more like quasi-Marxist frame. And when you adopt that idea of, well, we're going to be totally consumer oriented. We don't care how you make things or whether people are well paid or whether the suppliers have some sort of liberty or whether there are monopolies. All we care is whether consumers get cheap stuff. What you get is an economy dominated by Walmart. First in the 80s, Walmart and 90s Walmart, and then Amazon and Facebook and Google. And the reason the framing here is so important because the way that they said, is this stuff efficient? Is this stuff good for consumers? Is they said, let's look at the price. If the price is low, then it's good for consumers. Well, guess what? Google and Facebook's product is free, right? Like it's a non-monetary price. Same with Twitter. Same with a lot of these institutions. So all the antitrust people are looking at it and being like, I don't see any problem. Do you see any problem? I don't even see prices here. So what's the problem, right? And this is a new way of thinking about it. Before the 1970s, people used to say, is the company big and powerful? Does it have competitors? If it does, let's break it up, right? And then in the kind of Carter Reagan, they moved towards saying, no, all we don't care if it's big. All we want are low prices.
Right.
And so that's the mindset that we're in. And I think it's changing, right? So it's easy to say, yes, there's corporate capture. Like a lot of these people are kind of disgusting. But I also think that there's a real intellectual problem at the core of what's going on. So in other words, it would be easy. It's a little too easy to say it's corporate capture because then you have to say, why do millions of people, tens of millions of people love Obama? Why do they love? Why do different tens of millions of people love Trump? They're not getting paid off. They're not brainwashed necessarily. They just have a bad conception of policy in their heads. And I worked in the financial crisis in Congress. I know a lot of people that were working there. They were not all bad people. I mean, some of them were, but mostly they're bureaucrats. They're not getting paid off. People didn't get bribed to do the wrong thing. They did the wrong thing because they had bad ideas about how the world worked. They said, you know what we need to do in response to a financial crisis or in response to a crisis of big tech or whatever? Let's ask the experts what to do. And who knows more about banks than the guy that runs the biggest bank? And who knows more about technology than the guy that runs the biggest tech firm? It's our whole mindset that says we can't trust the people, we have to trust the experts. And that's not totally about bribery.
So if that, well, let me just challenge that a little bit. If that was the case,
No! No!
If that was the case, why is it that only the experts in the United States said don't give people a UBI and health care, but in every other country, the experts in those countries said do that? So if it was just the way people's minds were, I think it's the complete. I think what you're saying is there's partially true that there is the way bureaucrats think, but I think the bigger, and of course, you know more than me, but I'm just going to have to say it anyway, that I think it is corporate capture. Otherwise, it would play out exactly the same way around the world, but it hasn't. Is that correct?
Well, so I think, okay, so first of all, when I say experts, I don't mean people who are genuinely experts in that know a lot and are good at things. That's not what I mean. I mean people who are in an expert class, who have elite credentials, like economists are wrong about everything, but they're considered experts.
Yes.
And, you know, but they speak in the language of sort of like quasi-science, right? It's scientism. It's not science. It's like, but it's a language
Right.
that intimidates and impresses people, right? So if you're like, oh, the financial crisis is way too complex, that I ran into a lot of people who said, they're like, oh, it's too super hard to understand. And then they throw a lot of jargon at you. And when I started working in Congress in 2009, they were like, oh, the financial crisis, here are CDOs and all this other crap. And I kept reading books to try to understand what was going on. And no one ever said, and you have to figure this out, this is simply, I mean, the details are complicated, but it was essentially gambling with other people's money. That's what it was. They were just gambling with other people's money. They lost. Trillions of dollars of bets went sour. And they were like, someone's got to pay for this. Let's stick it on the middle class. And then they said, oh, this is super complicated. And in many cases, they actually thought it was really complicated. But what was happening is they couldn't imagine a world in which they weren't in charge. And in order to keep them in charge, you have to there's no actual justification for it. So what do you do when things are really not justifiable? You pretend that simple things are complicated, right? That's a way of obscure. It's a sort of a way of being dishonest, but they're not actually actively lying. They're more self-delusional. So that's what I mean. And now, if you want to know why this kind of thing hasn't played out the same way all over the world, I think it largely has. I think that there's a little bit of an overstatement. There's tremendous dissatisfaction all over the world. It's probably worse in the US, but you've seen ethnic divisiveness everywhere that these platforms are dominant. You haven't really seen anyone break up these platforms except one country. One country has done a good job, Russia. Weirdly enough, the Russians, because they have a competitive search engine called Yandex, because search engines are done via based on different languages. So they had a lot of scientists during the Cold War who could deal with computers. When the internet came along, they had this search engine called Yandex. So they had this competitive search engine. And then Google was slowly squeezing and killing it using anti-competitive practices. The Russian cartel office, the Antitrust agency, actually sued Google and said, you're not allowed to use these anti-competitive practices, which what they were doing is they were essentially saying, if you buy an Android phone, you have to use Google, you can't use Yandex. They said, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And then Yandex's market share went back up. So there's actually a competitive search engine market in Russia, nowhere else in the world. But everywhere else in the world, they're kind of like pretend to be very different, but they haven't really been that different. In terms of economic policy arrangements during the pandemic, that I'm not as familiar with. I think that there's just been different approaches. In general, other countries, like the best place, the places they've handled this really well are East Asia. They've handled the pandemic really well. In Europe, I think they've handled the economic policy a little bit better and the health policy a little bit better. Vaccinations are a little bit worse. But this is a problem across the West. Like it really is. We have not figured out. We have corrupt institutions, the same elite lawlessness. You have the same problems because it's the same ideas. It's neoliberalism is sort of dominant everywhere. They trust their economists who are terrible. We trust our economists who are terrible, and so on and so forth.
So what would you recommend happen now? Like you were right before we went to air, you were saying some kind of stuff that seemed radical. So how would you handle the social media platforms right now and the censorship? What do you think we could do and what should we do?
Well, just censor anybody who disagrees with me. I mean, just let me do the censorship. Obviously,
couldn't be worse.
Yeah, it's a problem solved. So this is confusing because there are basically two major problems. There are two major problems in law that interact with each other it's the interaction that's the problem. So the first is the monopolization, which we've talked about. Okay. And one way to deal with that is to say, if you are an important piece of infrastructure, whether you're AWS or you're Google or Facebook, you have to let everybody come onto your platform on equal terms, right? Sort of the same way that if you want to buy Verizon service, you can buy it at the same price for the same service that I can buy it for, right? They can't just discriminate against you because they don't like your politics versus me. This is a rule called common carriage, sometimes also known as public utility rules. But it's an equal treatment, equal services. Net neutrality is part of that. Civil Rights Act of '64 said, if you're a hotel or restaurant, you have to serve all comers regardless of race. It goes back thousands of years, common carriage. Serve all comers, same class of service. Okay, if you were to do that, right? If you were to say you're a major piece of infrastructure, you would also be saying to Amazon, you have to carry Parler. Now, let's say that Parler was knowingly contributing to political violence, right? Or knowingly contributing to dangerous, harmful things, which, I can bring you cases where, like, Grindr, for example, has been negligent in how they handle safety issues, right? That's Facebook has been negligent in how they handle fraud. Like, so if you were to say you've got to carry these guys, then you're saying you have to carry the ability to organize violent insurrections and dangerous stuff. That's problematic. But that gets to the second problem. The second problem is a law that's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Now, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is a legal shield that says that if you run a platform, this vaguely thing called an interactive computer service, then you are not liable for how people use that service, right? They can use it to do all sorts of terrible things. You can know that they are using it to do terrible things, and you are not liable for anything that happens.
So
now, there are a whole bunch of now.
So can I just let me just break that down for people. What you're saying is that the Section 230 law says that Twitter and Facebook are not considered publishers, so you can't sue them for anything bad that they publish, but they're more like a bookstore. So you don't sue the bookstore if there's something printed in a book that's libelous or you sue the publisher. So Section 230 allows them to actually act as publishers where they can censor stuff, but not be held responsible, legally liable for stuff. Correct? Am I getting it right?
Yeah, that's right. Let me give you just a very clear example so it's obvious what the stakes are. So Facebook has there's this problem in the military where all these soldiers go abroad to fight and scammers impersonate them. They come up with fake profiles of real soldiers. They then flirt with lonely women and get those women to send them money, right? The idea being like, you're dating a soldier who's abroad, you've never met them, send me money, I need money for this or that or the other thing. The soldier comes home, this woman is like, now we can have a relationship for real. The soldier's like, I've never met you before. Okay, this is a constant problem in the military. It always happens on Facebook. The New York Times did a story on this. Facebook could easily deal with the problem. They know what's going on. It's known harm. There are real damages. This would be a classic case of negligence. But Section 230 prevents anybody from bringing a claim in court saying you are knowingly causing harm through negligence, and you owe money for this. You need to put a stop to it. That's what Section 230 does. Another example, Grindr, which is a gay dating app. There was a guy who one day somebody showed up at his door. It was a guy who was demanding sex and wanted to do drugs with him. He was like, you've been flirting with me. You've been saying all this kinky stuff. This guy's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, no, you've been saying it on Grindr. Over the next year, about 1,000 men did the same thing. Some of them assaulted him. They all thought he wanted to have sex with them. Turns out it was an ex who was impersonating him on Grindr, and he couldn't get. They got restraining orders against this ex, but he couldn't get Grindr to stop this guy from making fake profiles because they didn't care. And he took him to court and said, you are knowingly putting me in danger. And the court said, this is true. We would love to hold the Grindr accountable, but Section 230 blocks us from doing that. So there is known harm that these platforms are inducing, it's like pollution. They don't care. They don't have to pay for it. So they pollute. It's what's going on here. What that means, and this gets to the interaction between the first problem and the second problem, what that means is there's a whole bunch of content and behavior that should be illegal, but is effectively shielded by Section 230. This includes the stuff that I mentioned on Grindr and Facebook with the military scams, but it also includes things like organizing violent riots, right? Which you're not allowed to do. That is illegal. But because of Section 230, Facebook, which is probably where most of it was organized, isn't liable for it. Now, what that means is that you got a lot of illegal stuff or a lot of stuff that's legal that should be illegal because of Section 230. And then if you say, hey, you guys need to do common carriage here, you guys need to carry this, what they then have to do is carry a bunch of stuff that should be illegal but isn't through their platform. So the solution here is to say, but on the other hand, if you say, hey, private monopoly, deal with this bad thing, then you're saying do this coercive, dangerous thing. Like you're saying, use your power arbitrarily to censor political people we don't like. And that is also very dangerous. That is coercive. That is what you're talking about. That is what a lot of the people that you folks. So the answer is pretty simple. Deal with both problems at once. Say, we're going to get rid of Section 230, so illegal stuff online becomes illegal, right? And then say, big tech, you have to serve all comers. And so you don't have to serve people doing illegal things. If stuff is illegal, if someone's being negligent, if they're defamation or whatever, you don't have to carry that because that's illegal. But it's determined through a court, through public institutions, through laws. You have to carry everything else. And and that's where the warlord analogy came from. It's like, don't let private warlords enforce arbitrary law to stop things you don't like. Make the stuff you don't like illegal and don't have warlords, right? That's the whole point here. That's the rule of law. And like either way you deal with it, if you force these guys to carry stuff that should be illegal, or if you say use your arbitrary coercive monopolistic power to get rid of stuff we don't like, neither one is the rule of law. You have to solve both problems at once. So that's the kind of answer here.
So let's apply that practically right now. Let's say let's say Donald Trump, or Alex Jones, either one, and people would say, well, the app had to intervene and censor them because what they were doing was hurting people. And what I always say is, if that's true, isn't there a law enforcement agency that's supposed to handle when someone else is doing something illegal and is hurting someone? Isn't there because otherwise now what we're doing is we're letting unelected bureaucrats, nameless and faceless bureaucrats, determine what is free speech and what isn't. And so what do you say to that?
Well, I mean, look, here's what I would say. Okay, Alex Jones does what he does, and there are always going to be Alex Joneses in a culture. But nobody cares if he's just on a street corner saying what he's saying. Who's responsible for Alex Jones? Obviously, Alex Jones. And you should, if he's doing something to incite violence, and there is a pretty high threshold for that in a court. But if you can prove it, you can prove it, right? However, Google, because they want to addict you and keep you watching so they can sell ads, recommended Alex Jones to their users 15 billion times. Alex Jones is Alex Jones, but Google made him a star. YouTube made him a star with their algorithm. Now, who's responsible for that? I think that Alex Jones, again, is responsible for Alex Jones. Google is responsible for making him a star. So if he causes harm, then Google should have to pay for part of that harm. And if they had to pay for part of that harm, they take your data, they process it, they put things in front of you, they bear responsibility for what they are doing. And there are different legal claims. You know, it's pretty, the claim, it's hard to bring a defamation suit. It's hard to bring an incitement suit. It's hard to bring these kinds of suits. These are not easy cases to win, but you can win them if they really are doing, fraud or really bad things, product liability problems. You can win them. So let it go to court. So
that's
right?
You're saying what Matt Taibbi said when he addressed the Alex Jones situation. Like, there's a body of law that journalists have been working under for decades, and it works fine. Why can't we let the law work? And people are like, but there's bad things happening, so we have to supersede the law. You're saying don't do that. You're saying let the law take its course, right?
Right. What they're saying is we don't trust the state, so let the warlord do it.
Yes.
Right. That's that is certainly one way to handle a problem, but it doesn't lead to, self-government, right? Like the warlord's name might be like Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, and you might be comfortable with that person, but it's still a warlord.
So,
right?
Yes. So it couldn't, but my point being, we can't leave it up to the interpretation of a nameless, faceless bureaucrat to decide who's inciting violence and who isn't inciting violence by their interpretation, because any organizing could then be considered inciting violence because there's potential for violence at this rally. Or like, let's say I was organizing another rally at the Capitol. They could say the last one was violent, so this one has got to be shut down too, because it's their interpretation. So,
I mean, you've already seen this. You saw they're trying to bring a case against a guy named Dore Mckesson, because Dore Mckesson is a Black Lives Matter activist, and they brought a suit against him, trying to hold him responsible for a damage that was caused in a riot where he wasn't rioting, he was just there. And they said, well, you're a prominent activist, so we're going to hold you responsible for this. I mean, he was let off because the claim wouldn't stand up in court. But the thing about these platforms is that they're not courts. There's no due process. So they could just say, yeah, you were there at a violent rally. We're getting rid of your ability to be on Twitter, to be on Facebook, to be on Amazon, to sell your book, whatever it is. Like, these are vital. Or, they took Trump off Shopify. I mean, somebody pointed, they were like, what's the danger there? Is he going to sell too many red hats? I mean, what's the problem? It's just like at this point, what they're trying to do is they're trying to push a large group of people out of society. They're just trying to say, you're not going to have representation. And that's a really dangerous thing to do unless, there's real kind of due process and some sense of legitimacy in how it's happening. And this is not due process. This is not legitimate. So but the thing is, at the same time, you also have to acknowledge that what Trump did was wrong, and also that some of this stuff is illegal.
Yes.
Right? And it shouldn't be happening. And now we should have law enforcement actually doing stuff about it.
You can agree that what Trump is doing is dangerous and it might even be illegal, but it's not for Jack Dorsey to decide, and you're arbitrarily. And the way he did it was complete bullshit. He's saying the reason why he did it because Trump said he wasn't going to show up to the inauguration, which something Joe Biden agrees with. That's the reason. So do you see the problem? And so when I say what you're saying, Matt, I say it in a much louder way, in a more aggressive way. When I say that we need to stand up for the rule of law, people then say, why are you defending fascists? So how do you respond to that when you say, we need to have a transparent process if we're going to take away someone's freedom of speech? And when you say that, people call you a fascist or you're defending fascists. What do you say to that?
Well, usually I don't respond because it's not worth it. It depends on the forum. I think if you're in a, like on Twitter, for example, I've stopped responding to a lot of that because it's not worth it, because that's just, people are getting addicted to outrage and they want to just like go after you. And I'm trying to pull back on that. I don't think it's good for me. So I'm sort of trying to pull back on that forum. So that's one thing, is you don't have to respond to it. On the other hand, if somebody says, look, you're defending fascists, what you have to say is that the right way to address dangerous illegal behavior is to have the state and the police deal with it through the rule of law. And we all agree that you have to do that. The problem is you're not going to retain a democratic society by saying, well, our fascists need to stop their fascists. We need, that's the issue.
Yes.
And that's what we have to get to. I think we can.
That's exactly so there's an authoritarian streak in the left, and the left is very much for controlling other people's speech. And this is proving it. People are cheering this on, unaware of the unintended consequences.
Well, this goes back to something that's always been a problem, I think, on the left, which is a sense of romanticism. So the left, many people on the left, and I think this is true across the board, not just on the left, but like a lot of left wingers are utopianists. They want a perfect world. They genuinely do. It's not an insult. They just believe that we can solve all problems. We can perfect our society, the kind of revolutionary sort of fervor and spirit. And if you believe that we can perfect mankind, then any problem is a political problem. And I think that the issue here is that there are just going to be bad things that happen in the world, and not everything can be solved through politics. So I think that like their emphasis on control and authoritarianism, and I don't think this is true across the left, but there's a lot of people in the left that are just romantics, and they're just like, oh, if there's somebody somewhere being treated badly, that's a place for the state to go. And like that's a problem. That's a bad way to see the world. And they don't. There is oftentimes isn't. There's a tension between like respecting the personal sphere, respecting people's agency, which means respecting their ability to do shitty stuff and be assholes to each other as long as they're not doing anything illegal. And this desire to like create a perfect world. And that like the ultimate like obnoxious strain of what we're talking about is like HR compliance bureaucracies. But that's like, and that's the like worst of everything, because that's like this left-wing control freak aspect married to this right-wing corporatism.
Yes.
I don't think it's pervasive across the left. I think the left is largely confused.
Yes.
And people do different things. But
yes.
I think it comes from a good place. It's just that
yes.
good intentions are not enough. You need
yes.
to think clearly about human beings.
So what? Yeah, exactly. Of course, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So is the road to fascism. And
right.
So when lefties are cheering on Donald Trump being censored and the way that it's happening, what they don't realize is they're siding with the corporation. That's really what they're siding with, is big tech and the surveillance state. That's really what they're siding with. Hey, everybody, this is the part where I tell you where all our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then this is why I tell you to join our premium program and get extra content, but nobody's got a fucking job. So just enjoy the video.